Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the series, Living in a Climate Changed World. And we're rethinking nature and recreation with Dan Gardoqui of Lead with Nature.
Good
This,
evening, everybody. Nice to see some of you. Part of
we'd
you.
love to see your faces if you're willing, but I understand if not.
Yeah.
Um, this series is brought to you by York Public Library
Yeah.
and York Land Trust and York Ready for Climate Action. And my name is Marina Males, and I'm the executive director of York Ready for Climate Action. We are a small nonprofit here in York that's working to raise awareness about climate change and solutions. And we are working to help the town reach their emissions goals of cutting carbon emissions 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And so we're doing that through our Energy Coach program, where we have volunteers who are going into people's homes and helping them learn about putting in heat pumps and solar panels and electric technologies that can help their home be more energy efficient. And we have various programs to raise awareness, like the Climate Action Fair this past weekend. And so we're so glad to be working with the York Land Trust and York Public Library to host this series. This is the third year that we've done it in a row, and it's been really wonderful. And so today we're speaking with Dan Gardoqui. He's going to present to you and give you all kinds of great information, and we'll save 10 or 15 minutes at the end for conversation and questions. And so if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat at any time during the presentation, and then I will call on you to speak there at the end. So event details, we're talking about the fact that humans have sped up the changing climate. It's going faster than any of us thought that it would when we maybe first started hearing about climate change. Dan is a naturalist and guide, and he's going to share personal observations of living close to the land for 3 decades, as well as suggestions for how to recreate more sustainability and responsibility in our region and beyond. And I wanted to just start out hearing from folks who are here before we dive in with Dan. The fact that you've shown up here makes me think that you're somebody who's observing climate change and observing what is going on in our region. And I wondered if there's anyone who would be willing to raise their hand and briefly talk about what changes you're seeing, what impacts of climate change you're seeing in this region or where you live. Anyone willing to speak up? While you're thinking about it, I'll say that I ask that question whenever I go out into the community. And here in York, we've had a winter of terrible storms and a lot of flooding. And so people always bring that one up. Sea level rise is top of mind right now for folks who live this close to the ocean. But any others that people would share?
Marina, I'd be happy to share a few ideas and
Thanks.
observations. Certainly, frequent flooding, frequent storms, and sea level rise are certainly top of mind. We're also noticing a migration of our species, and especially in the plant world. So, for example, like paper birch, likes colder climate, so that's moving more. It's moving upwards, so we're losing a lot of paper birch here. We're seeing invasive pests and invasive species have faster movement and coming into these areas. And when I think of climate change, I think of higher frequency of erratic weather patterns, more destruction, more loss, new types of storms and weather events that we're experiencing, which we're seeing here, especially with the Gulf of Maine warming the fastest anywhere else. So the connection between land and water is something not to go unsaid as well. But the types of plants and animals we're seeing in our communities, and including insects and diseases that they face, and changes of location, seeing more southern and western species moving into the New England area, and the devastating effects of some of these impacts, such as from like the flooding and more erosion, and changes to seasonal patterns. This was the winter that never was. So I know that everyone's experiencing signs of spring earlier than we would have normally seen.
Oh. Thank you, Amelia. Is that Amelia Nadillo from York Land Trust?
Yes. Hi, everyone.
I thought so. Thank you.
Hey, Amelia.
Karen, can you unmute yourself? Yeah, there you go.
Hi, I just was gonna add in everything she said. I've noted, this is a great summary, and also the lack the quiet that you hear when you're in the woods, the lack of species sounds around us that we grew up hearing is really notable. And I have trees outside my window. When I moved in, I rent an apartment in downtown Portsmouth, and when I moved in 10 or 11 years ago now, the dawn chorus woke me up every morning and now it does not. So that's been a huge
Wow.
notable difference in my actual neighborhood.
Wow, thank you. That's tough. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to share an observation?
I'll share a little. Sorry, I can't figure out how to raise my hand.
I saw your wave though, so you're all good.
Yeah, everything Amelia had said, my goodness, yes, she summarized it very well. I'm Robin. I work with the Parks Department, but also I work at Mount Agamenticus and also sort of charged with some work on the cliff walk. And certainly, yeah, I've seen some effects of sea level and big storms. So yeah, erosion is a big one for us that we've been dealing with more and more, it seems like every year at the mountain, with just more frequent, heavier storms. And also exactly what Amelia had alluded to was the invasive species and how that's impacting the work that we do too, like the die-off of the hemlocks and that sort of thing. But also more invasive plants and insects that we're having to keep an eye out for.
Thank you. Any others? All right, well, let me introduce Dan, who's here to speak with us. Dan Gardoqui has decades of focused naturalist and wildlife tracking studies, a master's degree in natural resources, and years of professional development in nature, leadership, and education. His areas of expertise include hunting, foraging, wildlife tracking, bird expertise, and consulting and mentoring with a focus on the nature connection. Dan lives in New York with his family. So Dan, feel free to say more about yourself if you like, and I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. Hey, everybody. Thanks for making it out this evening. Grateful you're here. And a little bit I'm looking around and some of the names I'm recognizing. I think we could actually just have a conversation because there's so many knowledgeable people in this room right now with a lot of, historical, useful information. There's a lot of knowledge here. There's a lot of experience. There's a lot of wisdom. There's a lot of shared experience. And I would also guess there's a bit of worry, anxiety, grief, fear, uncertainty. I know there is for me. That's real. And I think it's important to acknowledge. At least it is for me. It's not everything, but it's there. Climate change is the challenge of our time. I would say it is a very interesting to me, someone who's trained a lot in modern Western science, but also spent a lot of time with a variety of indigenous and other ways of being. It's a really interesting test of my comfort and confidence of nature's resilience. The first thing it always makes me think of is, am I saying nature's really resilient because I'm full of it and I'm really scared? I just really am hopeful. Or is there some valid truth to that? The other thing it really makes me wonder about is our attachment to the way things are and our assumptions around change. And I don't have the answers. These are things I struggle with all the time. These are things I wonder about. These are things I hold in tension because we have never had a static natural world. That just hasn't existed. I mean, our mountains are always changing. Our oceans are always changing. Our soils are always changing. The rate of change, the reason why it's some of the reasons why it's changing, yeah, those are different. I'm not denying those 1%. But change is our one big constant, and we are faced with a rate of change and impacts of that change that are causing serious challenges. And honestly, we're just trying to keep speed with this. I mean, the scientific world and us as human beings and as parents and grandparents and neighbors and community leaders are just trying to figure it out and trying to figure out what the best thing to do is. So there's a very large and a very small, a very global and a very local perspective that I think is important to keep kind of shifting perspectives on here when we discuss this, because they're all real. Yeah, so I just want to start with that, because to me, that's bringing present what's important, at least for me. And as we go along, I really want to invite you to use that chat to just throw in any of your thoughts, any of your ideas, your perspectives. And I just also want to say, like, I only know what I know. I know some things I don't know. And so if you have a different understanding, you have a different knowing or experience than I, please speak to it. Please feel free to inform me, to educate me in ways that maybe I'm not aware of yet. So, there's people here I know have much more experience in certain elements of this talk than I do, and that's fine. But I'm here to hold the space to get it going and get it cranking, and we're going to go into it, and then we'll have plenty of time to chat about it some more. So with that, let's say I'll dig into what we're doing. Some slides at least, and we'll see where that leads us. Okay, here we go. So there will be birds interspersed in my slides because I can't help myself. Birds are my gateway connection. They're my reminder of the fact that we live in a more than human world, and we share that with all these other species. And birds are fascinating to me as a focus on climate change because they can move so much and they interact with so many different places. This what turned out to be a terribly underexposed picture of glossy ibises I just really whacked around with and made it so it was kind of funky and cool looking, I thought. This is off Mile Road in Wells, so in Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, one of the southernmost sections there, here on the coast, on a coastal salt marsh, an area of high dynamic climate change impacts for sure. And every spring, and geez, where are we at? In about 3 to 4 weeks, we will start to have these birds migrating north through our area. These birds on their journey, they could come from as far as South America, Central America, Florida, South Carolina, who knows? It depends on the bird. They have a knowledge of place and an understanding of change in ways we probably never will. The amount of places they have to know intimately because it depends on their survival minute by minute, on their ability to thrive, their ability to breathe, their ability to make connections with each other, to stay safe. That's their daily experience. And even though they live somewhat short lifespans, they're also carrying inherited knowledge from previous generations. So we are not the only ones with technology and wisdom in the world. Many of you know this, but our wild kin, our wild neighbors also have this. And the other thing is they've been around for a heck of a lot longer than we have. And while they might not have hard drives and books and poetry, they have their own ways of passing down knowledge and emotion as well. And so tonight we'll touch in on birds a few times because I just think it's important to remember our perspective isn't the only one, but it's the one we know because we're human, right? We're all a bunch of apes here. Welcome, hello, greetings, fellow apes. We're all mammals, right? We all have little, hands and hair and all this fun stuff that mammals have. We're able to give birth to live young. Take a long time to grow them, though. Man, what work that is. My youngest is 18 right now. It's a long time. We're sensitive to mammalian perspectives on climate change, but there are many other perspectives on climate change, very little which we'll touch upon tonight, but I'll try and touch on a few because ours isn't the only one. And when I was part of the climate action plan in New York on I think it's Natural Resources Committee, which I see some of my fellow members here, I really tried to keep bringing that to the group. Yeah, we got to really think about, wetlands as recharge areas for us and for flooding and for safety. But we also got to think about them as these critical breeding habitats for our wild neighbors. Not just because like we're trying to be do-gooders, but because like they have a right as well. And we also are intimately connected with them in so many ways, from salinity of the water to turbidity and clarity and as seafood and as food for migrating birds like these ibises and so many other reasons. So yeah, so I just wanted to start with the birds. That was completely unplanned, and there it was. Okay, so real quick, little bit of background on me. I run a company right now called Lead with Nature for about the last 5 years, where I do consulting, guiding, and training for all sorts of NGOs, schools, nonprofits, land trusts, private groups. I do some executive coaching, leadership coaching, just helping small businesses get going, et cetera. But many of you know me from for the first 20 years in New York, when my wife and I ran, and my co-worker Matt Wild ran something called White Pine Programs, where we started a nature connection nonprofit here because I really felt like there was a need to have more structured time outside for kids, right? Because many of you probably grew up with time outside. I know I did, and I know it was critically formative. And I remember being on the cusp of that generation that was losing it. And I remember watching it, and I remember being like, okay, I was really given something. I got to try and pay this forward. And so from 99 to 2019, that's what we did. And a whole team of people who really made that happen, I have a lot of gratitude for. And it's still going on, which is great. Integrated in some of the schools, works with the land trust. It's awesome. I was ready to move on and go back to some of my own core work. And so that's what I'm doing now. I was raised in the Pine Barrens, near the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, which is this massive, huge natural area, mostly known for like bad, like mafia references and stuff like that, but actually it has like tremendous, interesting ecological diversity and wildness to it. And that's where a lot of my formative kind of understanding about the fact that we live in a more than human world came to me, and really made me understand a little bit about what I want to bring forth in the world. This is my family and I. So we never smart enough to take a Christmas photo. We're walking across the bridge on Christmas Eve in Gunkwit, Footbridge Beach, one of my other favorite little spots to pay attention to what's happening. Walking the river there on the Gunkwit River at the right tide, looking at the tracks and sign of mammals and birds and invertebrates, and then watching the birds moving through that area, paying attention to what's going on with the storms. Yeah, it's a special place for us. I'm sure many of us have these special places that really they're part of who we are. I mean, literally our DNA is over there, it's in us, we're all over, but it's also just part of our story, right? So that part of my story is just continuing to pay attention to birds and really use birds as a gateway for people to connect and understand habitats, native species, insect, you name it, all sorts of stuff, migratory flyways and weather and climate, yada, yada. And the other thing it's important to me here is the movement of amphibians. And I have to bring this up because tomorrow night, folks, is probably going to be a big night for migration of amphibians. So really encourage people to, number one, if you don't have to drive tomorrow night and it's raining, don't let those frogs and salamanders all cross the roads. I went for a little run out back today along Chase's Pond, and the wood frog vernal pools were just cranking with choruses. A little weird duck like, they're all crazy looking. They are going nuts. So they're ready to get moving, and they're very excited to breed. So the more we can stay off the roads on warm spring nights, we can allow our fellow critters to move safely from one place to another. I encourage people to check out Maine Big Night, which is a great way to engage at community science, and anyone can do it. It's super fun. You can adopt a road stretch and do some good work. All right, so let's start with the obvious change. If we look at global mean temperature, this is both combined land and sea, yeah, it's the old hockey stick, the rate of change, right? This last stretch here, these last 30, 50 years. And honestly, anecdotally, just these last 20 years here, and really since 2006 or 7, we've seen some insanely interesting and somewhat frightening, really warm years on record. And so that's the big obvious change, right? And what's happening is a lot of the changes, we extended this out for the last 500,000 years. We'd see all sorts of glacial and interglacial periods. Glacial cold, interglacial warm, glacial cold, interglacial warm. That's extremely natural and normal. We are in an interglacial. We are in one of those warming trends, but whew, the way we're getting there and the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is probably not going to go down unless we do something about it, folks, because we're the ones who put most of it in there. So it's going to be an interesting challenge. See, it is an interesting and challenging experience we're having right now. But the rate of change is what's most problematic. And many of us know all this, but I just threw a few slides in because when we talk about a more than human perspective, we have to remember we are just a blip on this earth in terms of our species. You know, they say if the earth was made in a week or something, if the entire history of the earth was in 1 week compressed into a week, we were at like 1159, 58.2 or something like that. We're so new. But, you know, the mountains, the glaciers, the processes of plate tectonics, these things have been around a long time. The soils and the rocks that are formed underneath us, they've been around, some of them billions of years. So the rate of change is relevant, you know. So I follow a guy, Dr. Matthias Chris, and he's a glaciologist in Switzerland. And he just had a couple images here I saw a while back that I snatched up, and I was like, wow, because these, you know, these are wild to see. We don't live in a place, you know, we have the last time we had like serious glacial activity in Maine was, well, somewhat long ago, but very recent in places like the high elevation Alps, right? So here's a couple of glaciers, same picture, same spot over the course of, you know, 150 years. Real big differences. And this is going on, you know, all over. I mean, I think there's over 500 different major glaciers, if I remember right, or almost 500 in this region. And, you know, the ice volume has decreased tremendously. I mean, sometimes it's over, you know, many years you either grows or shrinks a little bit, but we have had consistent loss of ice. And this is, you know, logometric in some ways. You start losing ice, and then you get more darker areas, then you get more loss of ice, and then you get thinner ice, and the ice spreads more and more. We've all seen ice melt. It happens fast, and it compounds. So, you know, we're seeing average, you know, even here just locally, we can look at some average winter temperatures. This is in my lifetime alone, you know, 5-degree increase here of average winter temperatures Fahrenheit, and many of us know this. If I throw up snow cover data and snowpack data and days of snowfall, blah, 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 yeah, we'd all see the same trends. Yeah. And it's not just us getting old and saying, when I was a kid, it always, you know, we had 3 feet of snow. Well, it's true. We did. And now we almost never do. And even just the 20 years I lived up here on Mountain Road and some of the highest elevation in York. Robin works at the highest elevation in York, but I'm a couple hundred feet below, actually 350. And even here, you know, we still get some snow when the rest of town doesn't, but that's even less common than it used to be. I mean, I used to schedule programs all the time around these factors, and I have all these seasonal calendars and planning around my work because they're very nature-based, and they're based on the timing of bird migration, the vernal pool activity, and snowfall, and all this kind of stuff. And even those that are only, you know, in this region, I guess I came to this land, we bought this land in 99. Anyway, 25 years just in this neighborhood, it's changed like considerably. So, yeah. So these warming temperatures are really affecting snowpack. So when we go from the global to the regional here, these last couple of slides, we can really see that actually southern New England is probably one of the biggest hotspots in the world right now for warming winters. It's kind of strange. It's also relevant because the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies in the world right now, which we won't even have time to dive into tonight in much depth. But we're looking at major decreases of spring snowpack, right? And really, there is no thing as snowpack, frankly, anymore in southern New England. I mean, there used to be, at least in higher elevations. And even here in Maine, ice out and snowpack. I mean, we had this, you know, this late storm that in years past wouldn't have been a crazy late storm. And it would have fallen on frozen ground, and it would have lasted longer, and it would have stuck around, and it would have melted at a slower rate, and would have allowed for more recharge of water in our systems. But yeah, most of it's already melted away in most places. So yeah, this is happening, and this is happening fast. This just came out. This study is a pretty interesting one. Was out of Dartmouth, Gottlieb and Menkins last month. This one popped out. It's like, oh, here we are. So thinking about region and thinking about recreation, I just want to start, we're going to split tonight into recreation and then wildlife, frankly. That's my nature piece, is going to be more about wildlife and habitat. But I mean, the recreation is obvious. So Protect Our Winters has been around a long time. They're a great group that's really been, I mean, outdoors industry, especially snow sports, have been very aware of this. You could listen to stakeholder calls, for stockholder and calls back in the early 90s for snowmobile companies and ski resort companies who were already like very worried about this, right? And the writing was on the wall. And here we are, dramatic changes, right? This less snow covers, less annual snowfall. It means less fun in the snow, folks. And people like to go have fun in the snow. People like to be outside in the snow. People like to have their recreation a variety of ways, whether it's slapping on a pair of old school snowshoes or, some Nordic skis, or it's hitting the slopes, or, snowmobiling or ice fishing, or, whatever you like to do, wandering around the woods, following animal tracks with me. These are things that are getting harder and harder to do. And it's not just that they're personally hard to do, it's concerning about, what's going on here. So there's been all these different initiatives and collaborations. This one's climate declaration. I mean, these folks are coming together saying, like, we've got to work together. We've got to get this done. We have to figure out how we're going to do a better job, because, not only is it a massive bummer on the industry, it's affecting people's jobs. It's affecting huge amounts of revenue. You can look at just so many. This year the Can-Am got canceled. The longest sled dog race, the biggest one here in the Northeast, one of the few remaining ones that's left. Just almost unheard of to cancel for lack of snow. Sometimes, yeah, just really rough. So there's just case after case of these things happening, right? And just a few weeks ago, right here in Maine, Climate Work Maine put together they did a great webinar, which I just got the summary of. I was working in a town that's not able to see it. But, outdoor recreation is about 4% of Maine's economy, which is like the 6th highest percentage in the US, as far as I was able to understand from the presentation. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. Okay. I knew we had a lot of outdoor industry workers, but I mean, it's been growing like crazy too. I mean, especially since COVID. Everyone knows here with any tie to recreation how much busier our outdoor spaces are and how many more people are engaging in outdoor activities. So, we also have a lot of outdoor gear manufacturing and retail here in the state. So, I mean, even just thinking about it from a dollars and cents point of view and how that affects our economic well-being, and then our ability to, contribute to and have the, the ability to work on climate action. This is an important topic for us too. Just specifically snow-based recreation was just under 70 million last year. And that was a little lower than the normal because we haven't had some pretty poor years, snow recently. So thinking about recreation, I just wanted to offer, we're rethinking some recreation. And that doesn't mean we don't do maybe what we've been doing, but we have to think about what are other ways and what are some opportunities to be addressing things like climate, because, nature isn't just our playground, right? There's a lot more going on there. And don't get me wrong, I like to go out and have fun outdoors in a variety of ways. And I just think it's important for us to also think about where are there opportunities for educational recreation? And there's a number of people on this call already doing this, who I know of, and probably many who I don't. But where can we take, where's the low-hanging fruit in terms of opportunities to be educating, informing, and activating people, in this world of a changing climate? I don't, in a lot of my work in the field, I don't consider myself a climate activist, but what I'm trying to do is those precursor steps, which is creating connection and engagement and care. And through curiosity and through engagement and getting people excited and curious, and then helping them understand the fragility of these systems too, to some degree, and also some of the resilience. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to engage people and meet them in this space, and also have some messages around how they can engage, how they can be contributing to more, climate action. So just a couple looks here. Again, we are part of this more than human world, and the outdoors, it reconnects us. Like we are hardwired to connect. All of our DNA, the short time we've been on this planet, is designed to be in connection with these spaces, right? right? No matter where we're from, no matter what our DNA, our origins are, all, all of our ancestors, for the majority of their time, we're living more or less as hunter-gatherers. And so we have ancestral, easy connections. It's like we already know how to do all this. We already know how to caretake and pay attention and learn. We've just forgotten a lot of the specifics. So it's like we've got the hardware, we need a little software update. And a lot of the work I do is trying to help people find those things they have passion and curiosity about in the more than human world and go deep, right? A couple of different seasons in a very similar area up on Mount A here. A quick story I just wanted to share was a long time ago, or not that long, I don't even know, 15 years ago or so. I had a young woman at UNH who came to do some wildlife tracking at workshops with me. And, people are often curious. Everyone wants to know about wildlife. People want to know about wild animals, especially mammals. They're sneaky. They're out at night. We don't get to see them too often. And she grew up in Southern California and really knew nothing about winter and was just like so stoked to be in the snow. So there was just this like, oh my gosh factor going on. But she also was extremely sharp and asked really good questions. And she tended to keep always asking questions about bobcats and lynx. And there was like a lot of like felid questions, family Felidae, kitties. And so, she just keeps, she kept asking these questions. She went down the road. A couple of years later, I encouraged her to connect with a couple of researchers. There was a big bobcat study going on in New Hampshire for a while. She connected with them. Long story short, she found this really strong connection to get engaged in community science, went on and did a master's, and continued to have like a full-time job in tech, which is not easy to do. And then really her shift, when she started studying bobcats, she started learning about vernal pools. And she got really curious about amphibians and reptiles, and then got really into turtles. And then very recently, in the last couple of years, her and her partner, they've started New Hampshire Turtle Rescue, and they're amazing. And they do really great work helping turtles navigate this challenging world we live in. So, I think it's important for us to remember, I think, that having action and excitement and the courage to work on these climate issues too, I think it's also just really important to make sure we leave space for us to find connection and joy and passion and curiosity around our connections, our birthright to be, in connection with the wild. So, oh, look at that timing. I didn't even plan that. That's handy. So this may be one of the first cats she ever tracked with me, actually. This young man, I think he was young. I know he was a man. I think he was younger. This young kitty, this Tom, he lived in New York for a while. I strongly doubt he's still alive because most wild bobcats don't live beyond 12 to 15 years, and that's about how long ago this picture was taken. This is one of my first trail cameras that was film. I remember this one. And this is late February when the males start to expand their territories, and they start to go and interact with the edges of female territories, sometimes 3, 4, 5, it really depends on resources and density of population. And this cat, traveled through this area quite a bit. And it took me a minute because sometimes I'm a little slow at learning, and sometimes my curiosity will overtake my sensitivity to realize, oh, wait, this cat really knows I'm here. I mean, this picture is probably 50 feet away from the camera, but the old camera had like a little had a little motor drive, so it made noise. It wasn't as quiet as the new ones. And this cat would always be looking when the camera went off. So I was like, all right, I love that I'm getting the picture. I'm not thrilled that it's like kind of getting it's a little bit of a quote unquote disturbance in the cat's day. And over the years, I've had to remind myself, and I've had others that reminded me, and I remind others that animals have agendas too. So this cat's on a pretty important mission. And, I wouldn't leave my cameras out or try and track these animals this time of year, because right now is their courtship and mating season. And I wouldn't want to interfere with that, or potentially a natal den where they may be trying to go breed. But earlier in the year, usually we'll backtrack them, so we won't try and push them if we happen to catch up to them, etc. So it's sometimes a tricky balance here. How do we get people engaged and connected and remembering our birthright as animals on the planet, to have connections with other animals and places, but also not abuse it, right? So animals have agendas too, is the mantra I try and keep in mind. Another thing that's been a little challenging in the nature recreation space that we need to get better at rethinking here is just making that space more inclusive and welcoming. kind of redefining outdoorsy, like the classic, like, 80s, like, college funded, fleece kid, like, or whatever. But like this whole idea of nature for all and making sure that we're including all sorts of people with all sorts of abilities and backgrounds and interests. And so in the last 5 years, this has really been changing and growing in very positive ways. That's about 2016 or 17. I've been to a number of conferences and talks and workshops, and it's been awesome to see more and more change and more leadership coming from different places and different perspectives. So part of rethinking, I think, recreation is also thinking about how do we make it more inclusive, because it's really important that we're connecting and getting, hopefully creating stewardship values, and that these things are arising in people from all over. And our country is from people from all over. It always has, well, it almost always has been, and it will be. So that's where we are. So I'm going to pause right there before heading into my second section. Check the chat, see if people have any thoughts, anything else that came up from there for you, anything you want to chat about.
Karen, do you want to speak to your comment, or I can read it?
Yes, thank you for inviting me to do that. I've just been noticing the more there's among people who are very observant of these changes that we're talking about. There's two different aspects of this. One is that I notice sort of the arts and crafts movement is very feeling very tender towards nature, and I see a lot more. I mean, even women's blouses that I get advertised on, social media have all these flower embroideries. It's become like a huge selling point. I've always noticed 30 years ago, I was just watching SUV ads where they like plow across the muddy puddle and go through the mountains and across the streets, and it's so amazing. And I hated those ads for the SUVs because I was like, well, it's kind of counter purpose. But to your point about feeling connection, I do think that maybe it was only when I was typing that comment where I was thinking, maybe there's a opportunity to tap into that sense attraction and tenderness for some. On one end of the scale is tenderness, on another end of the scale it's attraction, maybe.
I totally agree. No, thank you, Karen. And it's easy to sometimes just for me to judge something as like, well, that's not the way I would do it. But and I'm someone who sometimes has to do a funny dance because I'm a hunter, I'm a fisherman, I'm a forager, and sometimes I'll go on bird walks with people and like they'll ask me a question about a bird and I'll tell a story about hunting and they'll just stare at me like does not compute, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of ways I connect. There's a lot of ways I steward and care and love about things. And sometimes that involves taking lives and integrating them into my body and my family. Like that's just part of what we do. I'm not saying it's what you should do or not do. It's just what we do. So yeah, I think sometimes just meeting people where they're at, like, hey, at least they're getting outside. Like, and then what do we do with that? So thanks. All righty. So let's look at the next day was kind of rethinking, kind of like, or it's not even rethinking, that's assuming we're not thinking about this, but thinking about wildlife here. So this is Apis apis, the common swift. I made it like this is like a monster size one over the skyline of Bilbao and in the Basque country. There's a tiny little mayfly in front of it. And I chose to just create this little funny scene because of the importance of insectivores, the importance of insects. And those are two groups of vertebrates, vertebrate and invertebrate, that have suffered tremendous declines in the last few decades. Our insect eaters are struggling in a lot of ways. Oh, here I am just rolling around now. Come on, Dan. All right. So another thing is, just because I want to touch on it, and this is one of my favorite photos I've ever taken, and I love putting this photo to my slides, is addressing the Gulf of Maine, right? The Gulf of Maine is this massive body of water that we are a part of, we are adjacent to here for those of us down on the coast. And we're all connected to it anyway, because water and land are all connected. And it is one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world right now. like strangely so. And there's some theories and there's some good data, but there's also a lot of questions. But amidst that change, there's still young, gray seals who are curious. And this is off the island of Monhegan, going by on one of the ferries, on the ferry leaving the island after guiding out there for a week with a group. And it was a gorgeous day in the spring, in the fall, actually. This is September, of course, because he's a little big, or she. Anyway, and we're going around, he said, let's go around the backside of the island because we'll get a really nice view of the cliffs and the surf, and maybe we'll see some of the young seals in this one area. We'll kind of loop around it, give them space. And that's exactly what happened. And that captain's just like knowledge of place of that island, having probably, navigated that boat around that island in there thousands of times because he's been working there forever. Was just really cool to connect with, and to get down to level and have this guy pop up and just hear like breathing and sniffing and kind of giving us the side eye and watching us as we went by. There's still a rich, biotic, amazing environment there, and it's really special in the Gulf of Maine, and it's potentially very much at risk. It's very much at risk, and it's something we just, it's just real, and it's something that we are trying to understand. And it's extremely complicated, especially when we get into these big ocean systems. And when we think about wildlife in general, there's some buckets we can kind of put things in to at least get our brains going here. There's direct impacts of climate change, right? There's often just really direct things like, okay, there's polar ice cap melt, there's less sea pack ice, and that's going to be really challenging if you're a mama polar bear trying to raise a young one, and certain times of year and certain climates, certain food. There's indirect impacts, like Robin actually referred to this one. This is the hemlock woolly adelgid, a non-native little critter that attaches to the undersides of our hemlock trees. And that has been doing that for a long time, but as winters get warmer and we don't have really sharp, long, deep cold snaps like we used to. I think the last good one we had was a 2014 or 15, that polar vortex that nearly froze the pipes in many towns. Indirect impact here is that little insect is actually accidentally being carried on the backs of our migratory songbirds, and as they move around, and it's so complicated, right? And then this weakens the tree, and then we have a native species that's been here forever, like the hemlock borer, a type of beetle, who then just finishes the tree off because, well, that's what they're born to do. And it's so complicated sometimes, but we are seeing this. And hemlock is one of the hardest ones for me to swallow because this area, and any of you who know the whole Mount A area and this whole region, used to have tremendous, gorgeous, healthy, lush hemlock forests, and there are very few left, very few. If you're a hairy woodpecker, it's like you're heaven because there's more great woodpecker habitat in those decaying hemlocks than you can imagine. So good, bad, who knows, but change is hard sometimes, and that's been a hard one for me to swallow. And then we talk about abiotic interactions versus biotic interactions, right? And where we have these complicated systems of, air and moisture and wind and, sea temperatures and all these things that are interacting to create really challenging weather conditions, and therefore creating really challenging storms and risking life and limb and sometimes devastating coastal ecosystems. And then we have these biotic interactions where there's things happening between species, maybe at a new level or in a new way or at a new frequency or in new places that we don't think have happened in a while, or at least like this. And I just stuck deer and moose together here because, white-tailed deer carry a little roundworm in them, or that is harmless to them, but when they happen to poop it out, or it gets on the leaves when they're feeding, and then a moose goes and eats that, it often gets in those moose's brain and causes what we call brainworm, and will often kill the moose. So as we have species interacting, the same's going on with northern and southern flying squirrels right now. Southern flying squirrels carry a parasite that doesn't affect them, but is generally fatal to most northern flying squirrels. There's story after story of this stuff, that when things are getting together, sometimes it's beneficial and commensalistic and wonderful, and sometimes it's parasitic and deadly. And there's just so many biotic interactions happening. And some of them are layered on others, and those are connecting with the abiotic. And then there's the direct. There's just so much we don't know. And there's a lot of great people doing amazing work trying to study and understand and model and project this stuff out to get real data from the field, to do it efficiently, to do it cost effectively, and to then start to use modeling and start to, use, all sorts of tools of both modern Western science and indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous people such as the Wabanaki here in Maine, right? So there's land trusts that are working now in concert with the Wabanaki, and there's indigenous people serving on committees and boards in some of these scientific institutions, et cetera. So it's complicated, and we're just trying to figure it out. For instance, temporarily, this is from a webinar I watched today with one of my former staff, who's now an amazing, interesting scientist, Alexei Surin. He was talking about these like strange things going on where the southern tip of the range of these 4 species, if you want to play name that mammal in the chat, I'll let you try and guess who they are. These 4 on the southern tip of their range have actually found little like refugia, like strange little climate refugia, even though they're very climate sensitive species. All 4 of these are kind of at the southern edge of their range in this part of their range. Moose are circumboreal. You can find them in the boreal range around the world. But here, in Maine, I remember seeing there was more moose right here. I was seeing on average 4 to, and who knows, observations are, anyway, I saw a lot more moose 10 or 20 years ago than I do today. I'm out in the woods a lot, and there's just not that many. That's anecdotal, but the data actually backs it up. But in some little pockets, they're actually thriving. It's fascinating and it's complicated. So this was a cow moose that I saw a couple weeks ago. This was up around Jackman, Maine. I was out scouting in the morning for a tracking program, and picked up her tracks, and she was just watching me for a while. Finally, I caught up to the fact that I was being watched and grabbed the camera to snap a picture of her. But I noticed this little patch on her shoulder, and I noticed a little patch on her chest. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's her. That's very light, but it's relevant. That is signs of winter tick. And if you're not familiar with winter tick and moose, this little case study is relevant because this is a great example of the complicated world of climate change now it's affecting wildlife. Ticks get it. There's many ticks in the world. Many of us know about the deer tick, the dog tick. Maybe you've had Lyme disease like me multiple times. But many ticks are host specific. So they're parasites that only feed on certain species. This tick only feeds on moose. It looks a lot like our dog tick, kind of the bigger one eventually. But what happens is when you get enough of these ticks, and trust me, it's a lot. It's gross. I'm about to show you a picture. It's kind of disturbing. It can be tens of thousands. You literally, the moose start rubbing, they get so irritated by them. If you're at a tick bite, they're itchy and they're irritating. But they also start rubbing them off and they lose hair and then they lose insulation and they're also losing blood. I mean, little young calves can literally lose over half of this. Is kind of crazy. Have to replace half of their blood supply when they're seriously infested by these ticks. It's disturbing to see. We call them ghost moose. So if you look at, this is a classic example of a ghost moose in the spring, somehow survived, might not make it through the spring, but has lost over half of its hair. Probably actually more than that on this animal. Just brutal, right? And this is what it looks like when there's just one patch. This is from a necropsy from, Maine inland fisheries. These are both inland fisheries and wildlife pictures. And the head biologist, moose biologist there, he sent me this picture. And it's amazing what is happening. And the winter tick has always been around. But when our winters don't get as cold and don't stay as cold as long, and there's less snow cover over the duration of the winter, these ticks thrive. And so now these ticks are in abundance in ways they've never been, as far as we know, and they are devastating the moose in many ways. But really, that's only part of the story because it really depends on the type of habitat the moose is in and the land management history of that land. So there's some areas of that where certain habitats and lands, the moose are doing just fine. And in other places, they are doing exactly this, like someone just posted, rubbing on trees and losing their hair. And so it's a complicated system, but this is some of the things we're seeing. This is just a quick look. So NESAC is, if you're really interested in this wildlife stuff and climate change, go to UMass's NECASC website. You just type in UMass and then NECASC, Climate Adaptation Science Center. It's a bit wonky, but occasionally there's useful things that you can understand. This is just looking at projected changes in snow and in what we're calling flows of moisture. I don't have time to go through all this, but these guys are looking at modeling large systems and how it's affecting, patterns, intensity, and timing, and how that affects soils and different plants and trees and the animals that depend on them, and really looking at these big pictures, right? One of the things that they pulled out, Lynn Morelli's work, she's been doing amazing stuff for a long time, is these three species in particular here are they got high, what we call climate vulnerability, with a pretty high high certainty as well, or so lower uncertainty. So we're pretty sure. Moose is a little funky. It's a little more uncertainty around moose because some of their data points are showing they're doing okay in certain areas. It's confusing us, but lynx and hare, great example. Super specialist species that depend on very specific conditions to thrive. Whereas if we go down to like red fox and bobcat and deer, much more generalist species where they can thrive in a lot of areas. So we're seeing a lot of our more vulnerable specialist species really struggling with climate change, especially ones that are on the edge of their range, the edge of their habitat. Their bigger picture home range. But we're also learning that different types of habitat management, how we work with the land, really changes the formula. And some of that says, most of the time in New England, that's not in our hands because we have very little publicly owned land. So it's figuring out how do we continue to work with a lot of the forest companies, the paper companies, the pulp companies that own most of the land, and as well as the land trusts and the state and the feds who own them as well. So complicated but interesting stuff. Another thing with birds we're seeing is ecological mismatch. It's been going on for a long time. That's getting more and more real in many species, which basically picture a bird in migration, flying and arriving somewhere. When they're matched, the timing is great. They migrate, they get there, they lay their eggs just before the peak hatch of, say, certain caterpillars or certain flies, and so that they can feed those amazing protein-rich resources to their young, so the young can thrive, right? Birds have a super short window, migratory birds, to raise those families really quick. And if that timing is off, it devastates those numbers. Those numbers are already really low because so many other things kill and eat songbirds, but it makes it even harder. So, I think just trying to get towards the sum up here, there's, these global, regional, local, and these just personal things. When we're thinking about what are things we can actually be doing, first of all, I just want to suggest you really go back and look at the first 2 recordings from this series if you haven't already. Really useful, really good stuff, from very practical, from the town level to the state level. And then another one with Phil McKibben and Anna was just awesome. So thinking about different actions, for me, I remember the 80s was this kind of depressing, exciting time when we had, Exxon Valdez oil spill. We had to really starting to get aware of the devastation of rainforests, and there was a lot of activism around these topics, and we didn't even understand some of the bigger trends that were going on here. And and the fact is now we're dealing with a younger generation with a lot of mental health challenges, and one of those is climate anxiety. And this isn't just like kind of worried or kind of like I don't know, when I was a kid I was always worried like nuclear war was going to break out, but it wasn't like losing sleep many days of the week about it. It was just something on my mind. But we're seeing actually a lot of people really struggling with this, and it's symptomatic of a lot of other issues going on right now. But there's things we could be doing. We could be tracking our spending when banking. We could be thinking about where is our money supporting the kind of things we don't want to see happening here. We can engage in any sort of local climate action that's going on, right? And if you're here in the town of York, you're really fortunate because we have invested in this and we have people who are showing up. We can use more. This is from today on the York website. Applicants needed for the Climate Action Committee. So there's a practical way to engage. And even some of the subcommittees, so if you can't make as much of a commitment, you could do some of that. There's engaging and showing up is sometimes the best medicine for us, right? To do something. So we're not helpless, we're not hopeless, we're working. And then we think about our own houses here. This is from Project Drawdown. This Jerry Runty shared this in the last talk here, which is great. Really, what we're talking about is what are 3 big things we could do? We think about what we're eating. We can think about where it comes from. We can think about what our energy is like and our travel, right? There's 3 really big ones right there. I mean, massive changes, on a small level. So just want to throw a few little action items in there. And then we could do things like, if we're fortunate enough to have property or influence on property and land, using native plants like they're doing up at Mount A, like the town's doing in a lot of areas, like some of the local nurseries are trying to contribute, get people to do, really helps with biodiversity. If you're not familiar with Homegrown National Park, check that out. Great resources on this very topic on how we can basically create this big, amazing, biodiverse ecosystem for all sorts of species in one tiny little yard at a time. So another great resource to check out. And really thinking about how we rethink about local recreation. And we have an amazing resource right here, one of many, the York Land Trust, that has a fabulous amount of interesting, engaging lands that we can go out and responsibly enjoy, as well as public access points on the water. And so, I mean, we have so many options. There's no need for us to go terribly far, you know, and keep that footprint a little smaller. We can engage locally, we can learn locally, we can connect locally. And we can also do things like, you know, how do we contribute to community science maybe when outdoors, if you're curious about that. And you got so many people going, I just can't keep the phones out of the kids' hands. And if you can't, that's hard, I get it. But sometimes you can use it as a way to get them engaged. So, you know, something like iNaturalist, or, you know, doing a bio blitz, or who knows. So finding ways to engage youth in stewardship is going to be huge. And it is huge. It has been. It's part of what's been a big chunk of my life work, trying to create those bonds and connections. So hopefully when they become older and decision makers, they are putting it as a priority. So that is what I have. And I just want to make sure I save some time for some questions. And I know it's not a lot, but thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Dan. That was a really beautiful presentation.
Yeah.
I appreciate that a lot. So do put your questions in the chat, and I'll go ahead and ask this one here for the sake of time. When did Mount A,
Sure.
the Mount A region, lose the hemlock stands? From Bill Graben.
Oh, yeah, Bill. I mean, it's a process. So it's been going on for, I mean, Robin can answer that probably more accurately, but I believe all the way, there was started to track it in the 90s. Is that right, Robin? And then I feel like the last 10 years particularly has been like crazy fast, just crazy fast loss. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say the last 10 years, very noticeable. Yeah. It's still ongoing. We still have some, but they're mostly dead and dying.
Yeah. Yep.
A couple of comments. From Karen, ecological mismatch seems to also be affecting everything from orchards to backyard gardens. And
absolutely.
Yeah. From Mike Willett, on a paddle in Allagash Lake, rangers told us moose starvation is primarily the cause of death for those moose infected with ticks. They stop eating and spend all their time rubbing on trees. So we're talking about that before.
Yeah, and that area too. I mean, there's that little buffer strip along the Allagash, but it's very heavily industrialized forest, which is actually wonderful habitat in terms of biomass and food for moose. But it also is a really high tick area. So yeah, that area does see a lot of ghost moose. I actually was on a moose hunt up there this fall. It's the warmest ever week of moose hunting in Maine's recorded history. It was a terrible week. We didn't, none of the moose were moving at all. I felt terrible for the moose. Covered a lot of ground, but anyway, yeah, that's an area where there's a lot of moose, but they're also suffering. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's actually an area.
Shares...
The whole. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
I was saying the whole point. It's kind of interesting. The whole point of that hunt is it was actually designed to take a whole area where we're hoping to decrease moose density because the theory is that will actually help them have less parasite load. So it was a cow or calf only hunt. Unfortunately, they didn't even reach the numbers they wanted to because of the weather conditions for those 2 weeks. But again, there's many approaches that we're taking to try and understand and manage habitats and wildlife to try and help create, continue to support these critters. And sometimes that does involve some hunting.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining that.
Yeah.
Karen shares a PSA that Eldridge Hardware in York and Kittery Ace have committed to no glyphosate. In my experience, they do this and more to help us be better stewards of this beautiful place.
That's great.
Yeah. And I'll put a plug in for our York Ready for Climate Action Eco Home series. We send out a monthly action that folks can do. You can sign up on our website. And Debbie, who's with us today, has just written one about rewilding lawns and not spraying in lawns, planting native species so that those caterpillars grow at the right time for the birds, and putting meadows in part of the lawn to so that the grass has longer roots, holds more water, and provides habitat for local animals. So that'll be coming out in the next week with some more information and resources. Dan, thank you so much. Dan's shared his email in the chat for those who have questions or want more information. We really
you could
appreciate hearing from you.
Feel free to find me anywhere, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram and email and in person too. If you see me in the supermarket or in town, yeah, feel free to grab my arm, chat.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
thanks.
And
All right.
the next piece of this series will be on April 10th. We'll be talking with Amber Harrison from YCSA and Rosanna Patain
Nice.
about housing solutions that can be solutions to the housing crisis and the climate crisis at the same time. So we'll see you then. And thanks everybody for coming tonight.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks everyone. Have a great night.